In darkness over the North Sea, a bomber crew begins pushing bundles through a chute in the aircraft floor. Each bundle is paper backed with aluminum foil, cut to an exact length. Ahead, on German radar screens, individual aircraft start multiplying, into hundreds and then thousands. The night fighter controllers below have no way of knowing which of the returns are aircraft and which are paper. Welcome to Same Day, Different Century. I'm Zach. Today is July 24th. By the summer of 1943, RAF Bomber Command had been conducting large-scale night attacks against German cities for years, and for more than a year had done so under the explicit Area Bombing Directive. The Area Bombing Directive of February 1942 had made the industrial workforce and its housing a legitimate target, on the reasoning that precision bombing at night was not achievable, and that destroying the cities where war workers lived would break both production and morale. Bomber Command's chief, Arthur Harris, prosecuted the policy with conviction. He had spent this spring in what became known as the Battle of the Ruhr, and it had been expensive. Over roughly 5 months, Bomber Command lost on the order of 1,000 aircraft. A bomber crew's tour was 30 operations, and with loss rates running near 5% a night, the math was not encouraging. The reason the losses were so high had a name: Himmelbett. The Germans had built a belt of ground-controlled interception zones running from Denmark down to France. Inside each box, a Wurzburg radar tracked a single bomber, a second Wurzburg tracked a single night fighter, and a controller talked one onto the other. It was methodical, and it worked. Hamburg was chosen partly because of what it was and partly because of where it sat. It was Germany's second city, almost 2 million people, and its largest port. The Blom and Voss yards were turning out U-boats. There were oil refineries, engine works, and shipping. But there was also a technical argument. Bomber Command's new H-2S ground mapping radar drew its picture from the contrast between land and water, and Hamburg sat on a wide river estuary reaching in from the coast. On an H-2S screen, the city practically drew itself. British scientists had established that strips of foil cut to half the wavelength of a Wurzburg set would return an echo indistinguishable from an aircraft. The strips, codenamed Window, had been ready since 1942, and had been withheld out of fear the Germans would copy them and use them against Britain's own defenses. In July 1943, Churchill authorized their use. Every bomber in the stream would carry them, and a crewman would push them out by hand, bundle after bundle. On the night of the 24th, nearly 800 aircraft crossed the North Sea. The operation had a name: Gomorrah. The order set the object plainly: the destruction of Hamburg. The window worked immediately. The Wurzburg screens filled with false returns. Gun-laying radar lost its aim. The interception boxes lost their fighters. Much of the heavy flak below the bombers switched to firing blind. Of the aircraft that set out, about 730 bombed, dropping some 2,300 tons, and only 12 were lost. That is a loss rate of about 1.5%, against the 6% a rate of that size and depth would normally have expected. Roughly 1,500 people in Hamburg were killed that night. The bombing also crept backwards along the line of approach, as bombing streams tended to, spreading damage northwest of the aiming point across residential districts. Then the Americans arrived. The 8th Air Force flew by day, and on the 25th and 26th it sent B-17s against the shipyards, an aero engine plant, and a power station. The results were modest, largely because the smoke from the fires the RAF had started the night before rose thousands of feet and obscured the aiming points. But the raids kept the city's rescue and firefighting apparatus working around the clock, with no night of rest for 3 days. The night of the 27th into the 28th is the one the history turns on, and the causes are worth separating out carefully, because they compounded. First, the weather. Northern Germany was in an unusual hot, dry spell with very low humidity, conditions that make timber, roofs, and furnishings ignite fast. Second, the aiming point had been shifted a couple miles east of the previous raid, into Hammerbrook, Hamm, Borgfeld, and Rothenburgsort. Densely packed working-class districts of tall, close-set apartment blocks with wooden floors and attics. Third, the marking held. Roughly the same number of aircraft as before dropped roughly the same tonnage, but into a tight area in under an hour. Fourth, the bomb load itself. a mix of high explosive and incendiaries, in which the explosives blew out windows and stripped roofs, and the incendiaries then fell into buildings that had been opened to the air. Fifth, the fire service was already exhausted, and much of it was on the wrong side of the city, behind streets it could no longer cross. The fires did not stay separate, they merged. Once a large enough area burns at once, the rising column of superheated air draws in replacement air at ground level, and the fire begins to feed itself. That is a firestorm. Temperatures in the burning districts have been estimated at around 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Winds at street level reached hurricane force, strong enough to uproot trees and pull people off their feet toward the flames. The fire consumed the oxygen in the air. Many of the dead were found in cellars, killed not by burns but by carbon monoxide and heat. Around 18,000 people were killed in that single night. There's a persistent belief that this was engineered, that the mixture of bombs and the shifted aiming point were a deliberate recipe for a firestorm. The scholarship does not support that. The physics of mass fire were not well understood at the time, and the strongest evidence against deliberate design is simple. Bomber Command could not do it again on demand. It tried repeatedly for the rest of the war with similar tactics and produced only a handful of comparable firestorms. Hamburg required a specific coincidence of weather, urban fabric, concentration, and a defense that had been blinded. 2 more raids followed. On the 29th, nearly 800 aircraft struck the districts north of the previous night's burning. On the 2nd of August, the bomber stream ran into severe thunderstorms, scattered, and bombed erratically. That effectively ended the operation. Across roughly 3,000 sorties, some 9,000 tons of bombs had been dropped, and Bomber Command had lost about 90 aircraft, a fraction of what such an effort would ordinarily have cost. The Hamburg police president's contemporary report put the dead at more than 40,000. A later confirmed count reached roughly 31,600 by December 1943, and the figure most accepted today is around 37,000. Close to 1 million people left the city. Refugees carried first-hand accounts of what had happened across the whole of Germany. Albert Speer, Hitler's top architect, wrote after the war that he had warned that a handful of further attacks on that scale would halt German armaments production. It is a striking claim, but it comes from a memoir written by a man managing his own legacy, and historians treat it with caution. What can be measured is that Hamburg's war production recovered substantially within months, and many industrial facilities recovered more quickly than the devastated residential districts. What the raids did change immediately was the air war itself. The Germans abandoned the rigid box system that the window had broken. Within weeks, they were flying single-engine fighters directly over burning cities, hunting by firelight and feeding running radio commentary to fighters loose inside the bomber stream. New airborne radar sets, tuned to wavelengths window did not cover, followed. By the winter over Berlin, Bomber Command's losses were climbing again toward the rates that had made the Ruhr so costly. The advantage of that first night lasted a season. Hamburg is where the 20th century came to understand the destructive potential of the urban firestorm, and it learned that lesson only after creating one. That same day, different century. I'm Zach. We'll be back tomorrow with another date, another story. Thanks for listening.